Keith Weiner is an Austrian economist. He writes on monetary policy, inflation, gold, and credit for a variety of publications. He is the CEO of Monetary Metals, which offers investors a yield in gold, on gold, paid in gold. Today, he will be talking about the meaning, nature, and consequences of inflation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keith Weiner.
Joseph Stalin once said, "The death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of millions is a statistic." So I'm Keith Weiner, I'm CEO of Monetary Metals. I want to talk about inflation today. How do we treat inflation? Do we treat it as the moral issue, the tragedy, or do we treat it as a statistic? So inflation is, of course, a number published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they tell us that prices are rising at such and such a rate and so forth. In grammar school, we all learned you can't add apples and oranges. The Bureau of Labor Statistics expects us to believe that you can average apples and oranges and petroleum and rent and healthcare. So they give us this aggregate number, which everybody gets very upset about. I'm sure there's a lot of strong feelings in this room. I know in my audience there is. The thing I want to say about the rate of inflation is that it's actually a diminishing problem. That is, if you look at the curve of the rate of inflation over a CPI, so-called inflation, I'll get to that in a moment, over a long period of time, it is actually concave down. So if inflation is a tax on productive people, it's a diminishing tax. The official number in the United States is somewhere in the 2 or 3% range at the moment. Other people argue maybe it's 4 or 5 or 6%. Of course, income tax is 30%. So if this was the extent of inflation, it's actually not that big a problem, and it's actually diminishing over long periods of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to argue that's not the extent of inflation. It's actually something much worse than that. Unfortunately, our entire paradigm has this pernicious view, and I use the word pernicious very deliberately, of looking at inflation as a statistical thing or something intrinsic to the money itself. We talk about purchasing power. Economists talk about the purchasing power parity model of the dollar versus other currencies, the yuan or whatever. And I always like to say to them, do you mean the Yuma, Arizona dollar? Or do you mean the Midtown Manhattan dollar? And so this idea of purchasing power is not something that is intrinsic to the money, it's something else. And in addition to that, I want to make one other point before I move on, and that is there are a lot of non-monetary forces that can drive prices up. And so, if you look here, I don't know what the minimum wage is here, just south of the border in Seattle, there's been a lot of controversy raising the minimum wage to $15. Along with that, usually labor law has all sorts of other restrictions on businesses about who can do what job. You pick up a broom. No, I'm in the mop union. I can't pick up a broom. So they create these inflexibilities. They probably create loading hours where if you have a retail store, you can only load between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. By the way, during which you probably have to pay double time because workers have a right not to be asked to work at those hours. And so they have all of these non-monetary tax and regulatory and compliance and permitting and zoning and labor laws and so forth to drive prices up. The bottom line of which is that the monetary system could actually be driving prices down and non-monetary forces could be driving prices up. I wrote an article for the Sound Money project of the Atlas Network talking about what is sound money. I'm a little bit surprised they published it because I argued against their primary thesis. Most people, if you say what is sound money, they would say money whose purchasing power is constant. Well, the purchasing power, again, being intrinsic to the money in that view. So I argued, suppose you had general industrial efficiency gains of about 2% per year. My wife works for Intel. She's in the area of continuous process improvement, of Lean and Six Sigma and those sorts of things. Suppose Intel and dairy farmers and everybody else is improving productivity at about 2% per year, and therefore, of course, prices are falling about 2% per year. And suppose you're the chairman of the central bank, tasked by the president to maintain a disinflationary environment or sound money, 0% inflation. And so therefore, your job, if you see that an industry is improving efficiency at 2% per year, would be to somehow devalue, if that were possible, which it isn't, devalue at a corresponding 2% per year. And so I had a picture of the Norman Rockwell painting. It's called The Double Ride. It was published in the Saturday Evening Post, probably in the 1920s or 1930s. And he had these humorous, sort of slightly corny humor things. And so it shows a woman who's buying a chicken at a butcher. And she has her thumb under, the chicken is sitting in this metal pan hanging, it's one of those industrial scales. And she has her thumb underneath trying to push it up a little bit to lighten the load. And the butcher can't see that because there's like a fold of the butcher paper that sort of conceals her thumb from his view. But at the same time, he's pushing down behind the chicken, and she can't see it because the meat is blocking her view of it. And so I asked the rhetorical question, is that a sound measurement of the weight of the chicken? And is it sound money if industry was improving at 2% and the money was devaluing at 2%? Obviously, that's the answer. So monetary economics treats inflation as a statistic. It treats inflation as something that's intrinsic to the money. In fact, they even have their famous monetarist equation. I'll just give it to you, MV equals PQ. And so it becomes very antiseptic. And you can have all of these monetary economists, and God knows I've sat through any number of their presentations where they're talking about whether the Federal Reserve should have a little more discretion. Those are the ones that earlier our first speaker talked about, people, gentleman right there, talking about reactions out of fear. Those that fear the next crisis want to give the Fed more discretion to respond to that. Those that fear inflation more than the next crisis want to impose a rule on the Fed. And so I think it was Noam Chomsky, of whom I'm not a fan, who said if you want to impose dictatorship, allow a very vigorous debate, but only in a very narrow spectrum of what is allowed to be debated. I'm probably butchering the quote. And so you have the left principally saying, give the Fed discretion because they want the government to have unlimited power, essentially. And you have the right, but the entire allowable spectrum of debate is whether we are to have a monetary rule based on, as it is today in the United States, inflation, so-called, and unemployment. That's choice A. Choice B would be the so-called Taylor rule that measures a bunch of variables and then it spits out what you should do with interest rates and so forth. Or now C, it's becoming very popular. And there's a leading representative of the free banking movement who argues that the Fed should centrally plan our economy and our lives, not based on inflation and unemployment and not based on the Taylor rule, based on GDP. So as long as we have a consistent growth of GDP, then everything is fine. And he actually gave a talk at an objectivist conference in which he said you can have a free banking system, so-called, built on top of a fiat means force, base money managed by a central bank. I wanted to stand up, I wanted to play that character from The Princess Bride and say, excuse me, you used that word free, I do not think that word means what you think that it means, but there were several hundred people in the audience. I didn't necessarily want to be that guy at that time. So that's how economics as a profession, that's how the media, that's how everybody treats inflation as this dry, antiseptic, monetary economics. What's the money supply? Oh, and then, of course, we have the infinite debates as to the definition of money supply. So there's M0 and M1 and M2, and the Fed used to publish, but they don't anymore, M3. And so now there's John Williams of Shadow Stats who continues to publish what M3 would be. And then there's MZM and true money supply and Austrian money supply. And even within that, everyone's debating how to define money in order to measure the alleged rate of the growth of it, in order to figure out what consumer prices are going to do, which everybody presumes is the end, be-all and end-all of the whole thing. Milton Friedman said, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. Now, which is a curious thing for him because he defines inflation as an increase in the money supply, and yet here in his own statement, he's actually appealing to the so-called common sense idea that it's rising prices. And so he is presupposing a sort of linear direct connection between rising money supply and rising prices. So anyways, it becomes this abstract, antiseptic, dry discussion that most people quickly check out of. And I think, and both of the people who spoke before me kind of touch on this, people kind of, check out and they allow their, technocrat expert masters to have full run of the field if they don't really understand what's going on. And this idea of monetary economics, I actually argue that monetary economics is at an approximate state of understanding today where physics was before Galileo. So, and I realize that's a very radical statement. Before Galileo, they thought if you throw a rock, it will fly straight until it runs out of force, and it will go straight down. For lack of anyone going out into a field, finding an 8-year-old boy and say, throw a rock. And of course, then you see it's an arc. And so they didn't make observations. I'll conclude this little section. Is anybody familiar with the idea of Gibsons Paradox, so-called? So, one gentleman in the room. So, early monetarists were aware of something that's been forgotten. It's like forgotten lore today. And that is, they expected to find that the price level correlates with the quantity of money. Now, actually, as an aside, that's a very curious thing to do. Suppose we had a gold system in which the gold coin is money. An increase in the money supply means what? An increase in gold mining activity, right? So suppose before we have any kind of paper money, any kind of credit whatsoever, it would be an increase of gold mining. So that's scenario A. Scenario B, suppose you had a free market and a free banking system, as Canada largely did in the 19th century, as Scotland did for a couple of centuries, and you had an increase of legitimate credit, and I'll define that, that's going to be a key part of my talk in a moment. Or C, suppose today you have a pure irredeemable fiat system and the Fed prints more money. I'll talk about printing in a moment too. Wouldn't you expect 3 different principles or 3 different ways in which an increase in the quantity of gold metal, the quantity of legitimate credit, and the quantity of fiat issued by the Fed, shouldn't they behave differently? Isn't this one of those curious things like a solar panel company that says our solar panel produces 200 watts per meter, and they don't bother to tell you whether they mean Phoenix, Arizona, where I live, where the official statistic is 315 sunny days a year at our latitude, or whether they mean Vancouver, where even when the sun is shining on those rare days, it doesn't have anywhere near the intensity of Phoenix? How can you possibly quote an amount of power per square meter without addressing that? How can you talk about a monetary rule for how inflation is supposed to work without addressing, or quantity of money, without addressing what you mean by money and the very different means of operation in those 3 systems? This is what I call rubbish economics. So in his introduction, Jayant said, I'm going to talk about the meaning, nature, and consequences of inflation. So first, let me talk about the meaning of it. Don't define inflation as an increase in money. Number 1, it should be clear, we don't have money in the monetary system today. Nixon banished money from the monetary system in 1971. We are just beginning now to feel the real pinch of that. They thought in the 1970s that they'd seen the pinch of it with rapidly rising prices and interest rates. We're beginning to see the pinch of that. Oh, so to finish my thought, excuse me. Early monetarists expected to find a direct correlation between quantity and price level. And what they actually found, and this goes back to Knut Wicksell in the 1890s, was a correlation between price level and interest rates, not quantity of money. This has somehow been forgotten, overlooked, overwritten, evaded, buried under a pile, whatever you want to call it. This is forgotten and gone, and so Gibson, I think in the 1920s, wrote an article about this observation, and it's called a paradox. But if you understand it correctly, there's no paradox at all. It's only a paradox if you accept the assumptions that quantity has to go with rising price level. So, meaning. First, let me define legitimate credit. So suppose Jayant wants to borrow an ounce of gold, and I trust him and I like his business idea, and so I willingly and knowingly give him that ounce of gold with some terms and whatever, 5 years and interest rate and so forth. And Jayant has both the means and intent to repay. That's my definition of legitimate credit. So there's 2 criteria on the lender and 2 criteria on the borrower. The lender knows he's extending credit. The lender approves and agrees to extend credit. And the borrower has the means to repay and the intent to repay. So that's an honest, legitimate credit transaction. What happens if you start to remove these various elements? Well, today, most people don't realize the Fed is extending credit on their behalf, whether they wish to or not. So you literally have all 4 elements absent. You have the creditor or the lender who's not even aware. So most people think the dollar is money. I have a number of arguments against that, one of which is take one out of your pocket. And I don't know what the Canadian stuff says on it. In the United States, it says Federal Reserve Note. We call it a dollar bill. Bill is an archaic word for credit instrument. It says on a note, which is short for promissory note. It is an instrument of credit. And so if you have a stack of dollar bills under your mattress and you think you are hoarding money, you are actually extending credit to the Federal Reserve, or in this case, the Bank of Canada. So you don't even know that credit is being extended. And I see this all the time in discussions, especially amongst the gold bugs and the libertarians. Oh, you don't want to lend, the interest rate has to go up, the bond has to sell off. No one is going to lend to the US government. It is the most profligate borrower in human history. That's certainly true, although I think China is giving them a run for the money, maybe larger in percentage terms. But it's certainly an extraordinarily profligate, irresponsible borrower. Why in the world would anybody want to do that? You would sell the bond. And I say, for what? Paper dollars? The paper dollar is the Fed's credit. The Fed doesn't print money. The Fed counterfeits credit. And so by owning that dollar bill, you are extending credit to the Fed, and the Fed is extending credit to either the US government by purchase of its bonds, which it does in mass quantity, notwithstanding right now the so-called quantitative tightening, and the Fed extends credit to the banking system, who also buys Treasury bonds in mass quantity and mortgage bonds, all sorts of other rubbish. So you are a creditor whether you want to be or not, and presumably most people that are holding the Fed's paper are doing so in part out of desire not to hold the Treasury's paper. So they are trying to express their unwillingness to be creditors, and yet the system does not give them a means to express that preference. So in more technical terms, we could say the savior has been disenfranchised. There is no way to express, I want to opt out. One of the great virtues, there are many, of the gold standard is that if I don't like the terms and conditions on offer, including the interest rate, I can take my gold coin, this is a piece of paper, a proxy for a gold coin, and say, I'm out. But in the case of paper, if I take the paper bill out, I'm actually still in. So I've been disenfranchised. The government has defined the Treasury bond and the paper dollar bill that's backed by the Treasury bond as the risk-free asset. Now, how's that for a moral conundrum right there? That's the risk-free asset. Somebody posted to Facebook yesterday a picture of somebody with a jet engine mounted to some sort of skateboard contraption, and he was flying, keeping up with a Ferrari at like 90 miles an hour. And, and I was thinking, what could possibly go wrong? And I said, oh, that's the risk-free mode of travel. And he said, there's got to be an economics joke there anyway, you had to be there. So the meaning of legitimate credit is when the lender knows, the lender is willing, approves, the borrower has the means and the borrower has the intent. So what do we have today when the Fed creates credit on your behalf by issuing currency that you don't know about and wouldn't approve if you did? What is the Fed doing with that? Well, they're buying Treasury bonds, predominantly. Now, what is the Treasury bond? It is a promise by the federal government to repay with principal and interest. You can obviously see the federal government literally hasn't got the means to repay. It's mathematically impossible. And so we'll just talk about the debt that they acknowledge, or won't even talk about the debt that they don't acknowledge, which, if the government was run by the laws that govern private corporations, the way they print their books would be illegal, and all the officers would, in my opinion, rightly be in prison for accounting fraud. But according to the numbers that they publish, it's about $21 trillion. The United States has a population of 350 million people, something like that. But 96 million of them, a record high, are not counted in the workforce. And then you have the children, which wouldn't be in that statistic anyway. You have the senior citizens. You have the people who work for the government and their direct contractors. My rough guess would be maybe 100 million people working in the productive sector. To shoulder a burden of $21 trillion, I think that works out to $210,000 for every working person. So if husband and wife are both working, $420,000 of additional debt on top of their pro rata share of their state, which could be another $20,000, $30,000, their pro rata share of their city and county and municipal sewer district and so forth. And then on top of that, all the corporate debt, business debt, credit card debt, home debt, auto debt, and student loan debt. There's no way. I mean, mathematically, this isn't possible. So they don't have the means, and they don't have the intent. I mean, if every conservative, the so-called Paul Ryan, I think this is the last time I can think of when the conservatives said we're going to have a conservative budget in the United States, the most extreme, and this was painted as extreme, oh my God, the world's going to come to end if we only spend that much. What was Paul Ryan saying? We will continue to go deeper into debt this year, but 10 years from now, when I'm safely out of Congress, then that future Congress will have the discipline to finally begin to run a surplus and pay it down, which obviously is just political dishonesty and pandering. But clearly, there is no intent to repay either. So we're missing literally all four elements. That's my definition of inflation, is the counterfeiting of credit, which is very firmly a moral issue and not at all an issue of statistics. It's not a dry academic, write an equation and do the math. This is a hopefully clear moral principle that if you're borrowing without the means and intent to repay, you're a cheater, you're a fraud. People say that Social Security is the largest Ponzi scheme, and I say, no, it's the second largest. The dollar and the Treasury bond are actually the largest. So the dollar and the Treasury bond, what are they? It's almost a check-kiting scheme in a certain sense. It's circular because the Treasury bond is payable in dollars, and the dollar is backed by the Treasury bond, which is payable in dollars, and so on and so forth, ad infinitum. And so this leads us to the nature of this inflation and what is actually happening. So we define money as the dollar. That's the definition of it. Somebody referenced earlier the indoctrination in the schools. From the age of 3 years old, the children are indoctrinated. What is money? It's green pieces of paper. If you go to Google Images and you type in money, you will have page upon page upon page of green printed pieces of paper. You don't see any gold medal anywhere on that. So if that's the money, then the problem is we pay debts using money. But the money itself is a debt, or what they call as money is a debt. So what happens if you pay a debt with an IOU, with a debt? Right? Mechanically, it's impossible. So if I, in my earlier example, lent Jayant an ounce of gold, when he comes back to me at the end of that term and gives me back the gold, then not only is he out of debt personally, and he's legally allowed to walk out and no court can stop him and so forth, the debt itself has gone out of existence. The economics term for this would be extinguish. The debt has been extinguished. But if he owed me $1,200, roughly, or $1,250, roughly the same amount as the gold, then he's out of the debt loop, but the debt doesn't go out of existence. It's merely shifted. I now have 1,200 pieces of paper that say Federal Reserve note. So now the Fed owes me the money. Or Fed owes me something. Fed owes me dollars anyways. So what do? Well, typically I don't want to walk around with $1,200 in cash in my pocket. So I deposit that in a bank. Now the bank owes me. If you think you have money in the bank, you don't. You have a deposit, which is a loan or credit to the bank. Now the bank owes me $1,200 and the Fed owes the bank. what is the bank going to do? Well, they're going to buy a bond, because that's the business model of a bank and also regulation. So now the Treasury, the US government owes the bank, and the bank owes me, and so forth. It's circular. So I like to use the example of shifting this lump under the rug. And the lump is always there, and I can move it, and I can maybe hide it behind the lectern so nobody could see it, but the lump is always there, and in fact the lump is actually growing. And the reason why it's growing, necessarily growing, not because our Congress has fiscal incontinence, although they do, and not because they pander and people sell their votes for whoever's going to give them the biggest hike to whatever benefits program that they're addicted to, but because the nature of the monetary system is that this is necessarily what happens to do. The interest accrues on this, and the interest is added to the debt. The interest cannot be paid off either. And so the consequences of this are a system in which debt is rising exponentially, and therefore the interest rate has to fall, because otherwise nobody can service the debt, including the federal government. And so the conservatives are saying, well, what happens when the interest rate goes up? And the liberals, the Paul Krugmans, are saying, what are you talking about, problem with the debt and the debt service? Debt service as a fraction of GDP has never been lower. Well, that's right. That's because you're pushing your finger down on the scale called lower interest. And so if I were to give my answer to Mr. Roth, who spoke before me about the sense of dread that people have, in a zero interest rate environment, people who are working for wages can never save for retirement. When I started my career, the standard advice was set aside 10% of your salary, and then by the time you and put it in the bank, and by the time you turn 65, you'll have $1.5 million, which will be enough to retire on. Well, 85 to 90% of that 1.5 million was due to be from the compounding of the interest. I'm old enough that when I started my career, there was an interest rate you could get in a bank. Today, it's basically zero. So that means you can never actually attain your retirement goals. The net present value of your retirement, to put it in finance terms, is off the charts. And then when you get to retirement, you can't live on the principal anyway. You can't live on the interest, you have to eat the principal. And so I think I'm running out of time, but I want to make one other point. So obviously this leads to some sort of crisis. And so there was a speaker yesterday, I believe it was Grant Williams, but I think Rick Rule also touched on this same point, that gold is the only thing which doesn't go no bid. And I wanted to just point out this curious thing, and that is if you accept that the dollar is money and gold is a commodity, gold is the one exception. And this reminds me, or makes me think of before Copernicus, they thought that all the planets were, here's Earth, all the planets were going around the Earth. And so they had this very difficult problem to try to explain the so-called retrograde motion. These planets would go forward and then back and then forward and then back. And it's very complicated, both mathematically, but more importantly, how in the world can you explain what would cause this backwards and forwards thing? If the dollar is not money, but gold is actually money, then it's actually true and there's nothing exceptional, nothing unusual. It becomes much easier to understand. It's not gold going no bid. It's the dollar going no bid. That is gold withdrawing its bid on the dollar. That is the final consequence of this. And so I have a whole thesis that I talk about in my writings called permanent gold backwardation. And that is the process of the withdrawal of the gold bid on the dollar, which has begun to sputter intermittently since 2008. We don't see any sign of it at the moment, but I argue if it could happen at all, there's something terminal in the system. And so with that, I will conclude my talk.